Karen sent fake cops to search my ranch, then kicked out when my deputies stepped out first. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. It was just after midnight when the knock came. Firm, repetitive, like someone on official business. The dogs were the first to react, barking wildly as the porch light flicked on. On a quiet stretch of ranch land where late-night visitors were rare and usually not welcome, the sound immediately put everyone on edge. The homeowner, a man named Rick, had just settled in for the night. He lived out on several acres, far from the nearest neighbors, surrounded by hills and open sky. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened, which is exactly how he liked it. But that night, things were different. Through the peephole, Rick saw two men standing on his front porch. They were wearing what looked like police uniforms, dark shirts, badges that gleamed under the porch light, and utility belts around their waists. One of them had a clipboard in hand. The other had a flashlight, which he kept flashing back and forth across the windows and yard like he was sweeping for something. Rick opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain on. "Can I help you?" The man with the clipboard stepped forward. "Sir, we're with the county sheriff's office. We've received reports of suspicious activity on your property. We need to come in and take a look around." Rick paused. His instincts told him something wasn't right. The uniforms looked off, like costume versions of the real thing. Their badges didn't match. No name tags, no patches. And the one with the flashlight wouldn't look him in the eye. "What kind of suspicious activity?" Rick asked, keeping his voice calm. "And why wouldn't I get a call from dispatch before you showed up at my door in the middle of the night?" The man hesitated. "We're working off an anonymous tip. We don't always have time to call ahead. Just need to take a quick look around the property, that's all." Rick didn't buy it. He was ex-military and had worked closely with real deputies over the years. These guys weren't giving off the right energy. Too jumpy, too scripted, and something about the flashlight guy's belt looked wrong, like the gun holster was empty. "Hang on a second," Rick said, closing the door without waiting for a reply. He walked calmly back to his office, grabbed his phone, and made two calls. First to the real county dispatch, and second to his neighbor, who just happened to be one of the ranch deputies who patrolled their stretch of land. By the time Rick came back to the door, the two men were still standing there, shuffling nervously. He didn't open it this time. "You're not with the sheriff's office," Rick said through the door. "And if you don't leave my property right now, you're going to be talking to actual deputies in about 3 minutes." That's when things turned. The man with the clipboard cursed under his breath and started backing away. The flashlight guy turned, tried to say something, but ended up just following the other down the porch steps. They didn't run, not yet, but they were clearly shaken. Rick stayed inside and watched through the blinds as they climbed into a beat-up pickup truck parked just off the driveway. No markings, no government plates. They pulled out fast, headlights off, tires kicking up gravel. 3 minutes later, two real deputies rolled up. One of them, Rick's neighbor, recognized the truck description immediately. Turns out there'd been a string of similar incidents reported in the area. Two men, fake uniforms, attempting to gain access to homes out in the rural backroads. The imposters left behind a few things that night: a half-torn fake badge, dropped in the rush to leave, a boot print in the mud, and a chilling sense of what could have happened if Rick had just let them in. Law enforcement took the case seriously. They dusted for prints, took statements, and launched a wider investigation. Meanwhile, word started spreading in the community. People began double-checking credentials, asking more questions, locking doors they once left open. Because in places like that, where the quiet is sacred and the nights are dark, you learn fast that not everyone wearing a badge deserves your trust. Marcus had been behind on rent for months. The eviction notices came one after the other, each more urgent than the last. By the time the leasing office finally gave him a final 72-hour notice to vacate, he wasn't just out of time, he was out of options. The apartment complex was a mid-range setup just outside the city. Nothing fancy, but clean and quiet. The kind of place where people kept to themselves, and most folks didn't want trouble. But trouble had a way of finding Marcus. Or maybe he chased it, depending on who you asked. That morning, leasing staff arrived with a maintenance worker to inspect the unit before the lockout. Standard protocol. But when they knocked, Marcus didn't answer right away. Then, just as they were about to move on, the door swung open. There he stood, wearing a jacket with police printed across the chest in faded white lettering, a shiny badge clipped to his belt, and holstered at his side, a black pistol. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene, but his tone was sharp and his words came out clipped, like a cop giving orders. "You've got the wrong apartment," Marcus said. "This unit is under investigation. I'm conducting surveillance and I have documents to prove it." The leasing manager froze. The maintenance guy stepped back instinctively. It was such a bold move, so out of place, that for a second it worked. Nobody spoke. Nobody pushed back. Because who argues with someone flashing a badge and a gun? But something was off. For starters, the jacket didn't match any local law enforcement agencies. The badge looked real, at a glance, but too polished, too perfect, like it had never seen real use. And Marcus? He couldn't answer simple procedural questions when asked. What division? What case? Who's your supervisor? The leasing staff backed away slowly, playing it safe. But the second they got back to the office, they made a call. Not to corporate, but to the actual sheriff's department. 15 minutes later, real deputies showed up. Marcus was still inside, pacing the living room, apparently trying to shred papers and stuff gear into a backpack when they knocked. When he answered, he tried the same routine. Badge, title, authority. But this time, it didn't fly. The deputies asked for his credentials. He refused. They asked again. He stammered. Within minutes, he was face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind his back, while officers searched the unit. The badge, fake. The gun, real, but unregistered and tucked into a holster he bought online. The police jacket, just a novelty windbreaker you could grab at a military surplus store. And Marcus? He wasn't just behind on rent. Turns out he had prior arrests for fraud, resisting arrest, and unlawful possession of a weapon. By the end of the day, the charges had piled up. Impersonating a public servant, criminal trespass, and unlawful carry of a weapon. The eviction moved forward, of course. But now, instead of just losing his apartment, Marcus was looking at time behind bars. And all of it started with a desperate plan to buy a few more days. A plan that spiraled out of control the second he decided to flash a fake badge and pretend to be something he wasn't. It was just past 2 a.m. when the shouting started. At first it sounded distant, muffled, like a dream. But then the dogs began to bark, and that's when Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She heard heavy footsteps outside, a series of knocks. Not on the door, but against the walls of the house. The windows rattled with the thundering noise of boots hitting the ground. It was chaotic, unfamiliar. It felt like the world was crashing in. Before she could even process what was happening, there was a flash of lights outside, flashing blue and red in the reflection of her bedroom window. Sarah's husband, Mark, shot up from bed, already grabbing his phone to dial 911. "Stay down. This is a police raid. Stay where you are." A voice barked from outside. Mark and Sarah froze. They had no idea what was going on. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where nothing ever happened. The worst they'd ever dealt with was the occasional noise complaint. But now their home was surrounded. Suddenly, the door to their bedroom flew open and masked officers stormed in. Guns drawn. They didn't ask. They didn't explain. They just shouted orders. "On the floor! Now!" one of them yelled. They were on the ground within seconds, hands behind their heads, hearts pounding in their chests. Their young daughter, Mia, screamed from the other room. The officers grabbed her next, pulling her out of bed and forcing her to the ground too, though she wasn't old enough to understand what was happening. Sarah tried to shout at them to let her go, but the officers were relentless, handcuffing her to the wall as they searched the house. Mark and Sarah didn't know why it was happening. They didn't know what they'd done wrong. But in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. They were just being controlled, herded through their own house like cattle, confused, scared, and powerless. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then the reality began to sink in. These officers weren't here to stop a criminal. They weren't here to investigate anything legitimate. The whole thing, the raid, the guns, the shouting, it was all based on a false tip. As the deputies who conducted the raid realized the situation wasn't what they'd been told, The officers started pulling back. They lowered their weapons. One of the senior officers stepped forward, quietly asking Sarah if she was okay. When she nodded, confused and shaking, he told her the truth. The emergency call that led them here was a hoax. Someone had called in a tip that there was a dangerous criminal hiding out at the family's address, armed with weapons. But there was no criminal. There were no weapons. There was just a family whose home had been invaded by law enforcement, based on nothing but a cruel prank. The authorities moved quickly to trace the call. It didn't take long before they found the number that had been used. The caller was just a kid, a teenager with too much time on his hands and no concept of how dangerous his actions could be. The prankster was arrested later that week. Charges for filing a false report, terroristic threats, and interfering with law enforcement followed. The emotional damage, though, couldn't be undone so easily. For weeks after, Sarah and Mark couldn't sleep without hearing the sound of boots on their front porch. Mia had nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night in tears, unsure if it was real or if it would happen again. They had to change the locks. They had to put up extra cameras. The safe place they once thought was home now felt like a target. The authorities tried to reassure them, but there was no way to truly undo the trauma. And as the family slowly tried to rebuild their sense of safety, the reality of the situation kept weighing on them. Someone had used the power of law enforcement to violate their lives, all for a cheap thrill. It was a quiet afternoon at the local market, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The smell of fresh produce, the hum of shopping carts, and the chatter of casual conversations filled the air. But for one man, his trip to the store was about to take an unexpected turn. As he loaded groceries into his car in the parking lot, two figures approached him. A man and a woman, both wearing what looked like police uniforms. The woman was first to speak. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," she said, her voice firm, but with a hint of authority. He turned to face them, slightly puzzled. They didn't look like typical officers. The uniforms were a bit too new, too clean, and the badges, although shiny, looked like they had been hastily attached to their shirts. But he wasn't sure. They had the right look, the right attitude. Maybe they were just undercover. "Everything all right?" the man asked, glancing at the woman beside him. "Yes," she replied quickly, flashing the badge at him. "We've received a tip that you might be involved in an ongoing investigation. We're going to need to conduct a quick search of your vehicle and personal belongings." He hesitated, his instincts telling him something wasn't quite right, but he also wasn't about to make a scene in the parking lot, especially with what appeared to be law enforcement standing in front of him. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to stay calm. The woman took a step forward. "Just cooperate, sir. This won't take long." The man took the opportunity to walk around to the passenger side of the car. As he did, the woman gestured for the man to open the trunk. "Let's make sure there's nothing suspicious in there," she said, her eyes scanning the area like she was watching for any sign of trouble. The man opened the trunk, and the woman began to rummage through his bags. All the while, her partner kept the man occupied with questions about where he had been, what he had purchased, even asking if he had been in trouble with the law before. It wasn't until the woman lifted a small duffel bag and slipped something out of it, a wallet, a smartphone, and a few bundles of cash, that the man started to get nervous. He didn't remember putting any of that in the bag. "Sir, I'm afraid we're going to need to seize these items as part of our investigation," the woman said, a coldness creeping into her voice. Just then, the man realized what was happening. They weren't cops. They were criminals, posing as officers to steal from him right in front of his eyes. But it was too late. As he reached for his phone to call for help, the woman shoved him back. "Don't make any sudden moves," she warned, brandishing a badge like it could protect her. Within moments, they were done. The man stood helpless as they slipped the stolen items into their bags, nodding at each other. Without another word, the duo walked away, casually heading towards a black SUV parked nearby. It was an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows that made it difficult to see inside. As they climbed in, they drove off quickly, blending into the busy traffic. But they weren't as careful as they thought. The stolen items? They had left behind the man's driver's license, which had slipped out of his wallet. A receipt from the store, still in the pocket of the jacket he had left hanging on the back seat. It didn't take long before investigators pieced together the clues, tracking the vehicle to a location just outside the city. It wasn't long before the authorities had them. The woman, in her mid-30s, had a criminal record for identity theft. The man, who was in his early 40s, had a history of petty thefts and scams. Together, they'd been using stolen police uniforms to rob unsuspecting citizens. They were arrested at a motel where they had been laying low. The stolen goods, including the man's wallet, phone, and cash, were recovered. In the days that followed, the authorities warned the public about the rise of impersonators using fake police uniforms to commit crimes. It was a wake-up call for many in the area. The scam was easy to pull off, and it was something anyone could fall for if they weren't careful enough. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon when a black SUV with flashing blue and red lights pulled up behind a car on the outskirts of town. The driver, a man named Jake, had just finished his shift at a nearby warehouse and was heading home, tired but not expecting anything out of the ordinary. That is, until the lights flashed in his rearview mirror. He was confused for a second. The SUV didn't look like any official police vehicle he'd ever seen. It wasn't marked, and the emergency lights didn't seem to be as bright as the ones on a real squad car. Still, he figured it was better to pull over than risk drawing attention to himself. He slowed down and moved to the side of the road. The black SUV came to a stop behind him, and two men stepped out, both dressed in plain dark uniforms with badges clipped to their belts. The driver of the SUV walked up to Jake's window. He flashed his badge, a shiny, almost too perfect thing that looked like it had been freshly polished. "Good afternoon, sir. Step out of the vehicle, please," the man said, his tone authoritative. Jake blinked, a little uncertain, but complied. "What's this about?" "We're conducting a traffic safety operation in this area," the other man said from the passenger side. "We need to verify your documents and ask a few questions." Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with Jake, though. The badges seemed off, and the men weren't wearing anything that resembled proper police gear. They didn't have the right radio equipment, the radio wasn't buzzing with activity like a real officer's would, and their demeanor was too stiff, too rehearsed. But Jake wasn't sure. Maybe they were undercover. He'd seen some plainclothes officers around before. The men asked for his license and registration, but as Jake handed them over, he noticed something strange. One of the men was fumbling with his own badge, almost like he was trying to adjust it, and the other seemed distracted, looking over Jake's shoulder at the passing cars. That's when things took an unexpected turn. A marked police car came into view, and the officers inside stopped, noticing the situation unfolding on the side of the road. The officer behind the wheel, a trained traffic cop, immediately recognized something was wrong. He quickly approached the scene and asked Jake if everything was all right. When Jake explained that he'd been pulled over by the two men in the unmarked SUV, the officer's face tightened. "Hold on," the officer said, signaling to his partner. Without warning, the two men in the dark uniforms were handcuffed and shoved against the SUV. They were taken by surprise, barely having time to react. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The two men had been using a fake police vehicle, complete with flashing lights, to pull over unsuspecting drivers. They'd been stopping people for routine checks, pretending to be officers, and in some cases, even demanding money or valuables under the guise of fines or searches. But they weren't just ordinary criminals. One of the men had even tried to detain a fellow law enforcement officer, not realizing he was dealing with someone who knew how to spot a fake badge from miles away. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They were trying to pull over someone who was actually trained to deal with these types of scams. When real law enforcement arrived on the scene, the men were arrested, and it didn't take long for them to reveal they had no real authority. Their vehicle was equipped with fake sirens, and the badges they flashed had been purchased online. They were both charged with felony counts of impersonating public servants, and it was clear this wasn't their first attempt at this scam. It was an unusually quiet night at the local police station, the kind of night where officers rotated shifts without much fuss, and the station was mostly empty except for a few officers wrapping up paperwork. Outside, the streets were still and dark, the hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the silence. But inside, three individuals were quietly making their way through the back corridors of the building. They knew exactly where they were going. The thieves had been planning this for weeks. They knew the station's layout, its security systems, and its routines. The target wasn't just any building. It was a treasure trove of law enforcement equipment, including uniforms, handcuffs, and riot gear. By the time the officers had finished their rounds and started heading home for the night, the thieves were already inside. They'd found a way to disable the security cameras and slip past the locked doors that kept most people out. It was a calculated risk, and for a while, it seemed like they'd get away with it. They moved quickly, grabbing what they needed: uniforms, helmets, tactical vests, handcuffs. They knew the value of it all. Police uniforms and gear weren't just items of authority. They were the perfect disguise for anyone hoping to impersonate a real officer. With just a few key pieces of equipment, these criminals could walk into any situation, act as though they belonged, and deceive the public into trusting them. They worked fast, slipping in and out of the armory undetected. When they were done, they didn't stick around. They had what they came for and left before anyone could realize what had happened. It wasn't until the early morning when a shift supervisor did a routine check and noticed the security footage had been tampered with. Alarm bells rang. The police station had been broken into, and critical equipment was missing. Most concerning, the stolen items were directly related to potential crimes of impersonation. The reality hit hard. These criminals could use what they stole to conduct fake traffic stops, search homes, or even commit robbery while pretending to be officers. Within hours, the investigation was underway. Local authorities issued a public warning, urging everyone to be vigilant if approached by someone they didn't recognize as law enforcement. The stolen uniforms and equipment were circulating the streets, and it was unclear who might be using them or where they'd show up next. The investigation didn't take long. Through a combination of forensic evidence and surveillance footage from nearby stores, authorities were able to track down the thieves. 3 individuals were arrested later that week, each facing serious charges, including burglary, theft, and intent to impersonate a public servant. The stolen uniforms were recovered, but the damage was done. The police issued a warning to the community, advising them on how to spot a fake officer. The most important tip: always ask for proper identification when approached by someone claiming to be law enforcement, especially if something feels off. If they're real, they'll have no problem providing proof. It started with a simple emergency call to 911. A car accident, a crash on the highway, just another Tuesday morning. But when the real officers arrived at the scene, they weren't the first to respond. There was already a group of men there. Men dressed in police uniforms, checking on the victims, securing the area, and offering assistance. At first glance, they looked the part. They had the uniforms, the badges, and the air of authority. They even seemed to be following protocol. But something didn't feel quite right. This wasn't the first time. In fact, it had been happening for weeks now. A group of individuals had been using a clever tactic to intercept police calls and beat officers to the scene of emergencies. They had access to police scanners, allowing them to listen in on calls as they came in. With precise timing, they'd rush to the location, arriving before the actual law enforcement officers, and insert themselves into the scene. They didn't just show up and stand around. They were active, interacting with victims, offering medical assistance, securing the area, and sometimes even taking down names and making statements as though they were part of the official investigation. Their deception worked remarkably well. They fooled not only the victims, but also the real officers. Some of the responding cops didn't realize they were dealing with impersonators until much later. These men had done their homework, knew how to act, and appeared professional enough to slip past even the most trained eyes. However, the operation eventually began to unravel when victims of the fake cops started to notice inconsistencies. One woman who'd been in a car accident recalled a police officer who seemed too eager to question her about the crash. He'd taken her ID, asked for details about the incident, and even made small talk about her vehicle's registration. When she asked for his badge number, he avoided answering directly, offering vague responses that didn't sit right with her. The pattern continued as more victims came forward, describing similar encounters with the imposters. The tipping point came when one of the real officers recognized the group at a scene they had arrived at too late. After speaking with a few witnesses and noticing strange behavior among the supposed officials, suspicion grew. The victims' testimonies, combined with surveillance footage from nearby businesses, ultimately led investigators to the imposters. The men, who had been posing as police officers for weeks, were arrested. It turned out that they had been operating with a specific goal in mind. They weren't just there to help. They were gathering information, preparing to commit further crimes, and in some cases, even attempting to manipulate the outcome of investigations to their advantage. Once arrested, the imposters were charged with multiple felonies, including impersonating public servants, obstructing justice, and identity theft. The severity of their actions was staggering. Not only had they misled the public, but they had also endangered lives by interfering with real emergency responders. In response, authorities issued a public service announcement reminding people to be cautious of anyone who arrives before official responders and claims to be law enforcement. The community was urged to always verify the identity of anyone claiming to be a police officer, especially if they show up unexpectedly.